When you mess up the crime scene, when you mess up the handling of evidence, then you allow any theory, and that's the problem with this. Forensic science, if we just take the two words separately, forensic simply means in a legal context, and then the science is any science which contributes to the legal process. So we work in, generally speaking, in an adversarial system, which means there's a prosecution and defence. So the police do the investigation. Some of them decides, could be the CPS or the Procurator Fiscal in Scotland, decides they're going to mount a prosecution. Then a defence solicitor becomes involved, and that defence solicitor might need an expert to assist them to understand and perhaps challenge the evidence from the prosecution. You know, it's a truism about forensic science is it should be impartial, and it's very difficult to work within any system, even either side. I think to say that you're completely partial and not subject to biases is wrong. We know that from research. There's been quite a lot done on cognitive bias and how we tend to be biased. And so it seemed to me that separating the forensic science from the police would be a good thing. I mean, to some extent that's happened in England and Wales, but it hasn't really happened in Scotland. Northern Ireland, again, have a different system, and then the states have different systems. So everybody's gone a different way. There's pros and cons because clearly you would want that expertise available at a crime scene. The police should have access to good, I'll just call it forensic advice, but what I mean is scientific advice. What can we get from this evidence? What's going to be good potential evidence? What's not? And that takes us to that whole issue of, well, what is evidence? You know, when you go to a crime scene and you have no idea, you have a body or a fire, anything, you don't have a story as yet. So what is evidence? What's going to support a story or dispute a story? Because I've certainly been to scenes where the scientist arrives at the scene and then the senior officer or somebody will say, this is what we think has happened. So now you've fed a story to the scientist, and that scientist is going to now have that story. You can't avoid it. And so this, I think, is where the advantage of an adversarial system comes about, is that somebody, to some extent, is reviewing what's happened and said, well, was there a channeling down a particular road and you stopped looking for evidence for something else? And there's certainly been cases like that where it seems that the investigator has settled on a suspect, and it now becomes a case of trying to accumulate evidence against that suspect. Now the police are aware of that, and they undertake training. The difficulty with all of these is their unconscious bias. There's a chap called ETL Drawer who's done a lot of work on this. And as an example, one of the early things they did was take fingerprints cases where 5 fingerprint officers, different cases, had been told a particular story, and they all said these separate fingerprints, there's an ident. In other words, there's a positive identification of the individual for these fingerprints. The fingerprint officers, through ETL's research, are fed a different story about the source of the fingerprints. 4 of them changed their mind, and to say that it's not an ident, and 1 was undecided. So much for the objectivity of science. But even DNA suffers from that. We know there are biases, and there's been attempts to try and eliminate those, and I've published papers with others as to how we can try and do that. But it's very, very difficult, because how much information should the scientist have? How's that information fed to them? By whom? At what point in the investigation? These are the things that make it interesting for me just now, are those issues of how do we eliminate bias? And I think why it's important to have somebody checking everybody. DNA is inherited from mum and dad, so there's some crossover between the DNA you get from your parents and your own DNA. Equally, your siblings will have similarities to your DNA, but won't be identical. Your DNA might be unique. That's not really scientifically the issue. But remember, we're not looking at your entire DNA profile, if you want to put it that way. Imagine your DNA like a big library. Well, we're only looking at maybe 17 shelves in that library. You might have the same book as someone else. Many people, I presume, will have a J.K. Rowling book somewhere in the library. But equally, they might have Alice in Wonderland. And the more books you compare, the less likely it is that someone will have all of the same books as you. And so therefore, that's why we need to look at several areas of DNA, but we don't look at the entire library. So while you can argue your DNA is unique, then you cannot argue that the profiles that we're looking at will be unique. So we take blood, semen, saliva, anything, and we extract the DNA and we produce the DNA profile. And if that matches you, we can calculate how rare that profile is to give some idea of what's called the weight of evidence. So that's the simple part set aside, but most of the work that I'm involved in now, and most forensic science now, I think, is on DNA mixtures and on things that you can't see. So as we sit here now, I'm looking around at stands, at cameras, at microphones, which multiple people have touched. And so if we swab any of those items, my expectation is that I will find the DNA from people who touched them. But here's the rub. Those people might have touched other things that other people have touched and transferred DNA onto these new objects that the original people have never touched. So the case I was doing last night, 4 people on a gun. So question, who touched the gun, if any of them? Because also you might touch something and not leave your DNA. If you've just washed your hands, for example, the probability of you transferring your DNA reduces dramatically. But then again, the perpetrator might have been wearing gloves. So there's another change. Particularly nitrile gloves. So when we're working, you wear nitrile gloves. They stop transferring things from one thing to another. Although it turns out we can transfer DNA from nitrile gloves, something that sometimes the police forget, and they'll rake around somebody's flat looking for, under cushions and things. Then they find a drug bag and they lift it. Well, they could have transferred the DNA from around the house, So there's a whole lot of issues, and this issue of DNA transfer is probably the most topical one in DNA just now. But let's go back to the mixture, because now we've got your DNA, you've got my DNA, we mix it together, and we produce billions of profiles. So if you look at those as like false positives, there are more false positives than there are actual contributors. And so the issue is, how do we deal with that in terms of weight of evidence? And ultimately, all that's happening just now is that you're getting, well, you could be one of those contributors, and we'll give you a number. We'll give the jury a number. It's called a likelihood ratio. This profile is 1 billion times more likely if it came from Joe Bloggs plus an unknown rather than 2 unknown people. That is not a probability. And it's about the weight of evidence on 2 propositions. It becomes very difficult. If you're on a jury and I've just told you that and say, well, that doesn't mean it's 1 in 1 billion that it comes from Joe Bloggs, right? It's the probability of the evidence if it came from Joe Bloggs compared to the probability of the evidence that came from 2 other people, right? What's the problem with this probability of evidence? Let's say I come into a room, switch on a light, and the bulb doesn't go on. That's the evidence. What's the probability of that evidence if the bulb is blown? That's 100%. What's the probability of that evidence if the fuse is blown? 100%. right? So the probability of the evidence is a very different thing from the probability of the explanation. But the jury are hearing a comparison of the probability of the evidence.
Hi, and welcome to Deep.
We're a brand new channel from the team behind such shows as
Agree to Disagree, Minutes Within the Gap, to name a few.
And now we've launched this new channel to keep telling stories.
And we love to hear what you think. So if there's a particular person you want to hear from, a particular theme that you want us to cover, please drop us a comment, and also like and subscribe for more.
We really hope you're enjoying the channel, and if you are, we've just launched a brand new Patreon account with all sorts of extra content.
Early access, extra videos, behind the scenes clips, and even merch. If that sounds good to you, then check out the link in our description.
thank you, hit that subscribe button, and now back to our story.
America's a big place. And so we've done it in Florida, Texas, California, and New York. Most of my work's been in New York. And they say, so I'm not saying this, but there's different boroughs in New York. And the people in New York will say, well, depending on what borough, will depend on your chance of being found guilty or not. There's only 2 cases, I think, in my entire career where I formed a view about the verdict. Because generally speaking, I have no care what the verdict is, frankly. But in both of those cases are in Florida. One was a case of Pablo Ibar, actually Netflix, they were filming for that one as well. And this was a guy convicted of a triple homicide in the 80s, I think. As I said, crime, I don't know, but there is video of it, and it's quite hard. It was just black and white, sort of grainy video, but it's still hard because you see the flash from the weapons. And I don't think there was sufficient there. We did not think, 3 of us went to Miami for that one. And I don't think there was sufficient evidence there for that guy. And the other one in Florida was a guy called Greg Hill, I think, who's a coloured guy who was shot dead by the police. And the story is that he was in his garage, a neighbour makes a complaint about noise, the police turn up, they claim he produced a weapon, a gun, and raised it at them. So the garage door is closing and they shot him 4 times, 1 in the head. So I got involved because there's supposed DNA on the gun, but it was his gun. So it's hardly surprising his DNA is going. This is what I mean about, the kind of understanding of DNA. It doesn't time an event. My DNA will be on things around here for a long time. I'm afraid. They shoot 4 times. He falls dead, right, in a pool of blood. But the gun, for some reason, is in the back pocket of his shorts that are around his knees. I've still never had an explanation as to why they were around his knees. But for somebody to have the presence of mind to put a gun back in their back pocket after they've been shot in the head is quite remarkable. And what happened there is that a jury in Florida found him culpable and gave the family $4. Yeah, this is all public information, so it's no secret. The family sued the police, and I think that's where I became involved. And a Florida jury found in favour of the police again. I find that it's the only, one of only 2, what I believe to be completely wrong conclusions. I still don't have a full explanation for boxer shorts and then these, as I call them, cargo shorts. They've got pockets and things on them. And I can tell from the blood pattern on the floor and things, he fell on that floor instantly, and the blood's on his shorts and it's all on one side. And there are 4 bullet holes in the garage door, so they shot through the door. I've done thousands of cases, and so the fact that the 2 odd ones are in Florida may not be more than coincidence. I got the call from the solicitor in Belfast, Kevin Winters and co. A chap called Aidan Carlin, in fact, who was an assistant then, has now got his own solicitor's firm. You can pay me later, Aidan. And he said, I wonder if you could have a look at this case we've got. He never said what it was. And so I thought it'd take a couple of days to have a look at these DNA profiles. But then it became obvious that this was a new technique called low copy number that the Forensic Science Service, who were extant at that time, had introduced. And I'd never heard of it, but I started to look at it, and the more that I looked at it, I should explain, LCN's low copy number, so that means extremely low amounts of DNA. How do we know they're extremely low amounts of DNA? Because when you put the sample through the system twice, you get different results each time. I've talked about these DNA components, so you would see these components on one analysis, but not in the next analysis. So basically, ran it 3 times, you get 3 different results. And what they're trying to do is a composite, put it together. It's called a stochastic effect. So as you reduce the amount of something in a solvent, for example, we'll use soup as an example. So you've got, peas and lentils or something in soup, right? And you've got a thick soup. You put your spoon in, you will get peas and lentils. But as you dilute that soup more and more, you'll get to a point where you might get a pea, you might get a lentil, you might get both, you might get none. That's the level we're at with low copy number DNA. So to me, it meant, well, the first question is, well, how many samples do you need to take before you know you've got everything? And it also becomes much more prone to contamination because you're looking at molecules. And the more I looked at this, the more concerned I became. So we asked for more and more information about the validation. How do we know this works? And frankly, the more questions that I asked, the more curious, I'll put it that way, concerned would be a better word actually, I became about this being used as evidence. And so that's how it started. And ultimately, I think I had a team of about 6 or 7 people working on that for months, because there was so much information coming out that we had to analyse, and the whole evidence handling system was problematic, which I think has made Northern Ireland Lab one of the best now. I think they learned a lot of lessons in that trial. And I had a lot of sympathy for it. I remember at that time there was the Troubles. There were serious issues about even whether the scientists could access areas. There were, let's say, other involvements at scenes that might have got there before the scientists would get there. And so I attach no blame to that. It was a circumstance that it shouldn't have been, but it was, but that was the reality of it. The issue was the alcohol level of the driver, Henri Paul. And of course, they had done post-mortem, they had samples from all of the victims, basically, and therefore, it was quite obvious that there was an issue around where the samples had come from. My recollection was like 4 blood samples left the mortuary, 5 samples arrived at the lab, my recollection. And things like the alcohol results were published before the analysis was actually done, which is curious. I'll use that word again. And so I was asked about whether we could tell whether it was, these tubes. So what I said was, well, easily, because in effect, if somebody's blood has been in a tube, we're definitely going to get the profile. But also there was these other post-mortem samples, and they were all in a Tupperware box, frankly. This is, again, is public because I think they were shown at the inquiry. So, the lab had probably the highest profile case that century, never mind anything else. And they were in cardboard boxes and fridges and freezers and not logged in any way. And the way the French sealed them was by string and sealing wax, right? Not exactly the most secure system. No, that's true. Yeah, I was surprised myself. And the police had gone along, they'd photographed the contents of all of these boxes that had these samples in. But weirdly not the one that these samples were in. And ultimately the box, I only learned at the inquiry, had gone missing, as you do so. And we'd asked for the lab records. The French refused to do that. And then I asked for the blood sample that the alcohol had been measured in. I was wanting to do the DNA. But they said that it had all been used up in the alcohol measure. Well, right away, there's a problem with that because you don't use any blood to do an alcohol measure. You're actually taking the gas from above there, the airspace above the sample, right? So you just sample the air above the sample. You don't actually use up any blood. So I then asked them for the record, you tell me, how many mils you used, what volume of blood you used, but they simply refused. So I hadn't much to go on. But the other issue in there was they had a carbon monoxide level, a very high level of carbon monoxide, which was curious. And initially, people had said that this was simply due to the way the sample had been collected. So it's a phenomenon called post-mortem drug redistribution. So it used to be, right, when you die, if there's any drugs in your blood, it starts to diffuse from the arteries and veins into the tissues. So you get a false result for the level of drugs in the body. And it used to be that to get the blood for sampling, you just scoop from the bottom of the body. So a cadaver on a slab, if you start to take the organs out, the blood collects basically along your spine, and you would just scoop out the blood. And it gives you a good average, I suppose, but it's not the concentration of drugs in the blood. And I think there was a confusion between carbon monoxide, which is a gas, as most people would know, and drugs in the blood. So there's an issue about why there should have been such a large carbon monoxide. And of course, if this sample had a high carbon monoxide and the other samples did not, then that raises another question. But the easiest way would be to take the tube, take some of the blood. Even if you emptied the blood from the tube, there'd be enough DNA there for easily enough material for us to get a profile. Then compare it to some of the other post-mortem samples, which were undoubtedly from Henri Paul. Well, that opportunity was never provided. When you mess up the crime scene, when you mess up the handling of evidence, then you allow any theory. And that's the problem with this. And it doesn't just apply to that particular one. I mean, that was one of the issues in Omagh, was that the evidence was all in open bags and things like that. So there's another case in Dundee, I think, where the police had thought they were being helpful and opened all the bags in a murder case in the gym, and thereby allowing the potential for transfer of DNA. Now, that wasn't the police's fault. They didn't know. Forgive them, Lord, they knew not what they do. And so I think this is why education and keeping everyone involved up to date on what the science can deliver is important, which is why we're trying to do things like this. I hope the police are listening as well. I find a little troubling the public's interest in crime. Karen, my now wife, she loves this law and order and special victims unit and things like that. We cannot be in the same room when that's going on. I think it's quite unhealthy, the interest in crime, and it seems to me the more gruesome the crime, the more interest there is. My daily work is murders and rapes, and I'm probably dealing with 15 to 20 murders at a time. They might be murders. I might find it's a murder later on. The charges that are relevant to me, I think the charge is put in one of our case records, but it's not something that I would look at to see what would happen. I think one of the ones in New York just now, and I only discovered this by accident last week. It was actually the person was cut up allegedly in a bath, because I was being asked about the lack of findings. And why are they interested in the lack of findings? It's because the allegation is this person was cut up in the bathroom, and now what's the probability that there was no DNA found? Well, that's a how long's a bit of string kind of question, really. But I mean, that's interesting because, well, how would you? And then there's bleach. How did they search for DNA? Because if someone used bleach, for example, to clean up, then one of the tests for DNA it would detect bleach, and so the whole place would light up, kind of thing. Sometimes the records aren't very good. The case I was working on last night, a bag was recovered from the hall, and the weapons were in the bag, but 2 sentences later it says the weapons were recovered from a bedroom. And I still don't, the lawyers trying to find out about that just now, but there's an inconsistency in the evidence. And if I have to consider the DNA transfer, for example, let's say it was the guy's bag that somebody else was using, that would explain his DNA on the weapons. It could have been is it his bedroom? You know, lawyers don't think to tell me this, but there's a good example of something where, well, I don't need to know initially, but now that I've done the profile and let's say we agree that it's his profile, which I'm not as yet, then these issues of transfer become important, so the context becomes important. The further you go back, the more chance there's been problems with the collection and the processing of the evidence. And I think the first thing to say, I mean, people say, well, first of all, you get solves, right, from these. And I think you've really got to question the whole evidence handling thing. And again, the issue of, well, does the presence of DNA, you know, you get semen in the vagina, for example, it's hard to say, oh, well, she must have fell, right? And that's a different situation from your DNA being on a weapon, for example, where it can get there by a multitude of different ways. And we can never know those ways, right? And that's the problem. How do you calculate the probability that it got there by any means other than what the prosecution are saying? Because that's basically anything that's not the prosecution story. But then we've got these exonerations through DNA as well. And I think just because you find someone else's DNA at a scene does not mean that the person who's been convicted is actually innocent. And there's a misunderstanding around that as well. Cases are very rarely settled just on whether someone's DNA is there or not, or at least shouldn't be. I understand where if you find someone else's DNA, then there's an issue. Now, for example, the recent case, Andrew Malkinson, right? Well, I was involved in that case in 2010-11 and said that this was someone else's DNA that wasn't his. And the lawyers were advised of that at the time. I don't ever remember giving evidence or giving a statement. Then I was asked again about the case in 2017, and we did some more work and said the same again, and you need to test this. If there's one thing I would change, it would be the ability to present evidence better in court. And that means the scientists being allowed to expand on their answers, use whatever visual aids they want, but that requires the lawyers to be better educated about the scientific evidence and understand it, so that not only can they ask the questions of their own side, but do proper cross-examination of the opposite side.